former AEW Women's World Champion Saraya, otherwise known as Paige from WWE, is no longer with AEW, announcing on her podcast this week that she had departed from the company amicably. This comes just 2.5 years after she first debuted for the company back at Grand Slam 2022, and really speaks to one of the core issues that AEW has been trying to deal with over the past year or so, that being their bloated roster. We have heard and discussed the reasons why AEW needed to stop signing so many free agent talent, and the reason is because of situations like this. You have a talent like Saraya, who has all of the potential and all of the realization of that potential before her. She's a former WWE Divas champion. She helped ignite the women's revolution in WWE, and she was also a cornerstone of an era of women's wrestling in NXT that you could argue would not have been able to happen without her, and specifically her background, understanding, knowing, and being around professional wrestling ever since she was a baby. And that is why when she first debuted in AEW, along with the fact that she had spent the past few years before that on the shelf due to an unfortunate neck injury, there was so much praise about this signing. Saraya signified not only that AEW was a place where you could have high-profile talent sign and succeed, but it was a place that could ignite another revolution in women's wrestling. And while the returns on that specific point have been diminishing, the fact of the matter remains that when Saraya first debuted, the potential was through the roof. People were talking about the idea of her winning the AEW Women's World Championship basically off the bat. People were talking about dream feuds with the likes of Thunder Rosa, with the likes of Dr. Britt Baker, DMD. The sky was the limit. And this came just a couple of months after it was announced that Mercedes Moné had walked out on WWE, and knowing what we know now with her eventually appearing in New Japan Pro Wrestling and then later AEW, there was even talk of those two igniting their rivalry and telling a story of how Paige's original injury was actually caused by Mercedes, which obviously did not happen. And if we look at Paige's run in AEW, you can point to a few very specific moments where things seemed to be going well. You had her first match back at Full Gear 2022. Then you had it all culminate in a almost year-long build towards All In Wembley Stadium, 80,000 plus in the building. Got to witness her win the AEW Women's World Championship with tears in her eyes. This may have been one of the greatest moments of her life as her family walked to the ring, as Queen played in the background, and she was truly crowned in that moment. But it doesn't mean that things were roses and sunshine from there, because while she had arguably the biggest moment that one could have on one of the biggest stages in the history of professional wrestling, not many people remember what happened after that. And that is one of the big issues with Paige's run. It feels like Paige's run was plagued with a lot of start and stop. And while we do know now that there were some limitations on how frequently she could wrestle given the severity of her aforementioned injury, the issue wasn't necessarily having her wrestle. You can have a wrestler have a presence on TV week in, week out without having them wrestle. MJF is the perfect example of this. MJF is always in the limelight. MJF is always feeling like an important character. MJF is always present on AEW TV, but he only wrestles once every month, and that is if we're lucky. So it is completely in the realm of possibility for AEW or any wrestling company to have someone with the potential limitations that Saraya has as far as how frequently she can wrestle appear on TV and appear meaningful. But that's not what her AEW Women's World Championship reign was. It felt like her World Championship reign became a bit of a secondary act to others in AEW and others specifically in that women's division. And then after she ended up losing the AEW Women's World Championship, Paige did almost nothing of significance. She was relegated essentially to a full-time talent on AEW Rampage, which, as we've talked before in previous videos, was at that point a pretty much dying breed and a dying brand. And when her brother came into the picture, it felt like this was just a bit of a sideshow of what people really wanted. People didn't want Paige to just be wrestling on Rampage. People wanted Paige to be wrestling in meaningful matches. They wanted her to be telling meaningful storylines, but that ain't what happened. And while the Rampage stuff wasn't all bad, you had the rise of Harley Cameron, who got to really show her talents. The fact of the matter is, this was not supposed to be a launching pad for Harley Cameron. It's a good thing that it was, and it helped launch her career and give her the experience that she needed to be where she's at today. But it was supposed to be for Saraya to feel like the star. And the worst part about her AEW run was that Saraya felt like she was one of the biggest stars that entire company had when she first walked in. And when she announced that she was cleared, there was jubilation and joy across the professional wrestling world. And just fast forward a couple of years later, and it feels like no one really remembered those moments. And a lot of it is because of the way that she was presented on TV. She wasn't presented like the big star that we all knew her to be. She wasn't presented as this amazing, game-changing pro wrestler. She wasn't even presented as a game-changing character. She was barely presented. And if AEW wants to fix some of these mistakes that they have made, they have to look no further than the situation with Saraya, because it is indicative of a lot of the issues that they've had over the past year, not only with their women's roster, but their roster entirely. And as for Saraya, there's talk that she may go back to WWE. I do think that that door is open. As far as whether or not that will happen, I guess we'll see.